What are some creepy historical facts? Story 1. When the French revolutionary Maximilien Robespierre realized he was to be executed, he shot himself in the mouth. He was unsuccessful, and when they took him into the guillotine, the executioner ripped off the bandage holding his wounded jaw together, causing him to scream in agony before the crowd until he was silenced by the blade of the guillotine. Story 2. There was this one fortress in Russia that the Germans were assaulting during World War I, and the Germans knew the Russians didn't have gas masks, so they gassed the place up. When the Germans thought the Russians were all dead, they went inside, but were attacked by surviving Russians that looked like zombies, with their faces torn off and distorted by the gas, as well as cloth covering parts of their bodies, and so the Germans retreated out of fear. Story 3. When the Portland-class heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis was torpedoed by the submarine I-58, the sailors that survived were left adrift in the Pacific Ocean for several days, and hundreds died from dehydration, hypothermia, delirium, and shark attacks. Of the 895 men that survived the initial sinking, just 316 survived to be rescued. The captain's stories and the aftermath was also a sad one. The Navy attempted to court-martial him for the sinking as they asserted he had failed to zigzag, but this was later proven to have been irrelevant, and there was evidence the Navy had put the ship in harm's way by failing to report submarines in the area, not providing an escort, and taking 4 days to rescue survivors despite 3 SOS signals being received. Though his sentence was remitted, some of the family still blamed him and would harass him for years, sending him mail with messages such as, "Merry Christmas, our family's holiday would have been a lot more merrier if you hadn't killed my son," and he was burdened with guilt for the rest of his life. Story 4. In 1963, an American man used a payphone to call a British newspaper. He told them to call the U.S. Embassy for some exciting news, then he hung up. The man was never identified. 30 minutes later, President John Kennedy was shot. Story 5. Fatal familial insomnia is an inherited disease caused by a mutation in the PRPC protein, cellular prions considered common to all cells that do not manifest any harm to the body. The disease usually starts in middle age. Initially, it is difficult to sleep, progressing to intense insomnia, hallucinations, delusions, and dementia. This is because the thalamus, responsible for controlling sleep wakefulness and aiding the response of the senses, is compromised. Evolution is fast and invariably leads to death. The median survival time for the onset symptoms is 18 months. It is usually caused by a mutation in the PRCP protein. It has 2 forms, fatal familial insomnia, which is autosomal dominant, and sporadic fatal insomnia, SFL, caused by a non-hereditary mutation. The diagnosis is made from the study of sleep, tomography, PET, and genetic tests. Fatal insomnia has no known cure. The first recorded case was in an Italian man who died in Venice in 1765. He survived 6 months without sleep. Story 6. When Anne of Cleves was brought to London to meet her future husband, King Henry VIII, he decided to do this thing where he snuck around and tried to mac on her. Supposedly, even though they'd never met, she was supposed to recognize him as her one true love. She was all, "Who the hell is this old dude trying to get on me?" And he was kind of insulted by that. He ended up divorcing her later without ever consummating the marriage. Story 7. The Carol of Deering is known as the ghost ship of the Outer Banks. 100 years ago, the unmanned schooner drifted ashore with no sign of its crew. The only living thing found on the ship could unfortunately not offer a word of explanation. A gray, 5-toed cat who was completely unharmed and lived to bestow a prodigy of its 5-toed ancestor of the islands. Story 8. During the 1918 flu pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu, the symptoms were horrible. Your lungs would start to get holes in it, not allowing the patient to breathe, killing him or her. Your skin would turn blue because of lack of oxygen, and when nurses moved the body, there would be a cracking noise from the body. Graves would hold about 8 people in them because of how many there were. More perished during the 1918 flu pandemic than both World War I and World War II combined. Story 9. Residential schools. Heartbreaking rather than creepy, basically stealing indigenous children from their family, forcing them into awful facilities where they were tortured for speaking their native languages, and anything else you can think of relating to their own cultures. The saddest thing is these programs didn't end until 1966. Actually, the last residential school on Canada closed in 1991. We have to sit through hours of lessons in school learning about what Canadians did to natives. Story 10. In Sao Paulo State, Brazil, there was a relatively huge group of Japanese immigrants that don't accepted Japan was defeated in World War II, and they just went to the countryside streets attacking other Japanese immigrants with katanas because they don't agree with them about it. They would call regular Japanese immigrants as makegumi, people who are losers. Yeep. I've been growing up listening about those stories, and I'm always terrified. They were cruel and kind of sadistic. A real slice of complete fantasism into a Brazilian colony. The group doesn't exist anymore. To be honest, for more than 6 decades, I think, and even then my mother, she's Japanese Brazilian, doesn't feel comfortable even to say the group's name out loud in her own house nowadays. And they just don't exist anymore. Gosh, to be honest, I was so terrified about them when I was a kid listening to my mother's stories that it's passed through generation to generation in a really dark tone. This is somehow a taboo to colony until now in Brazil. That I think I can't write the name of the group here too, lol. I don't really know how to explain. I just know that when you manage to listen to the survivors' stories, it is like real cold horror. Story 11. I don't remember the year and if this is crappy enough, but I think it is something. A group of Argentinians and Uruguayans rugby players were traveling on a plane when it exploded and crashed on the Andes mountain range. They spent 3 months on the crash site. The creepy part is that when the rations of bread and chocolate ran out, they started eating their friends. And for making creepier, the guy who was a little knowledge about medicine recommended where the best parts to eat raw. Story 12. Adolf Hitler had secret bases all around Europe. Many of them haven't been found yet or haven't been completely explored, and the government in some areas is still preventing the exploration of them. This applies to the ruins of Fuerteventura, when the Führer is said to have sailed to Argentina. There was evidence on experiments on plastic face surgeries, and the local police keeps giving absurd explanations to forbid exploration of that base, such as, you can't afford to bring sappers here. People say that went there with the most important officers to change their faces so nobody would recognize them. Then he went to Argentina to begin a new life. But why is the police preventing further exploration? Story 13. In the past, people used mummies for everything from medicines to colors to paint with. There was even a tonic to drink that had ground up mummies as part of the ingredients. As for painting, the color was called mummy brown. It became in such high demand that, in some instances, the remains of executed criminals were mummified and used to satiate the demand of artists. A lot of artists initially didn't realize mummy brown was actually made from mummies and thought it was just the name. When it became common knowledge that it was made from real mummies, it became kind of a hot topic in the art community, with many artists deciding to boycott the pigment and some even burying their mummy brown paints in an effort to return the modicum of respect to the people whose corpses they'd been using as art supplies. Story 14. Zhang Jingzhang, also known as Yellow Tiger, was the leader of a 17th century peasant revolt which conquered the Chinese province of Sichuan in the end days of the Ming dynasty. There he lived the life of a warlord, in constant battle, and eventually descended into madness and barbarism, wherein he turned upon his own people in merciless slaughter. Story 15. The Leather Man was an individual who would walk the same 360-mile route between the Hudson and Connecticut rivers, approximately every 30 days, for 30 years. He was named Leatherman because of the hand-sewn leather clothes he wore and the fact that he never spoke to anyone other than shopkeepers for supplies and would never divulge anything about his past. He is believed to be French and Quebecois because a French Bible was found on him when he died. When his grave was recently exhumed to test his DNA, no remains were found. Story 16. Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique was written by him for the woman he was relentlessly stalking and harassing. His idea was to basically reveal to her that he had written it for her after she attended the performance, which he had pressured her into attending. Somehow, that worked, and I believed they married. Don't believe the marriage lasted. They literally did not speak the same language. Story 17. Vlad III, better known as Vlad the Impaler. It's said that when he impales the Ottomans, he'd use a stick with a dull tip to impale them from the bottom through the mouth straight up. And from what I've heard, he uses sticks as dull tips because it would push organs aside rather than stabbing through. So they won't just die right away, but they would have to suffer painfully. I can't imagine being a soldier marching through a forest of my comrades moaning in pain, knowing that if I made one mistake, I would end up with them, suffering their fate. Story 18. The Little Albert Experiment. one which aimed to find if fear was integrated in our brains or taught by parents. A baby was shown various things: puppies, rabbits, rats, masks, burning newspapers, etc. Being a child, he had no reaction to any of them. Following this, he began presenting soft, fluffy things to the child while slamming a gong with a hammer from behind a curtain to scare the child. The child developed a phobia of white, fluffy things. The experiment ended because this child he was from the daycare on his campus had moved away with his mother. Chances are little Albert is still alive and psychologically f***ed as a result of this experiment. Story 19. The Raft of the Medusa. In 1816, France sent a ship called the Medusa to go reclaim the French African colony of Senegal. The captain was appointed based on politics rather than merit. Captain Dumb ended up running the ship onto a sandbar and refused to dump the cannons in order to make the ship light enough to get back into sea. The giant raft they built to hold the ship's cargo was eventually used to float the 147 people who couldn't fit onto the lifeboats. The idea was the lifeboats could tow the raft to shore. The lifeboat folks, including the captain and the governor, decided to cut off the raft and leave everyone for dead when they sailed to land. After 2 weeks, there were only 15 men left alive on the raft, and boy, did they have a story to tell. Story 20. One of the creepiest events I tell my students in my Western Civilizations class is the Ecclesiastical tribe of Pope Formosus around 875 AD. This event was called the Synodus Horrenda, also known as the Cadaver Synod. Formosus had been dead for 7 months, but the new pope, Pope Stephen VI, found it necessary to exhume Formosus's body and bring it to the papal court to answer for accusations of perjury and ascending the papacy illegally. Granted, the Catholic Church had gone through many strange things over the course of its history. However, this event always gets a reaction, especially when the Jean-Paul Laurens painting is shown. Story 21. Ever wonder what happens if you crash into a wall at 185 miles per hour head-on? Gordon Smiley's 1982 Indy 500 qualifying crash is exactly that. Dr. Steve Olvey is the source of its account. While rushing to the car, I noticed small splotches of a particularly gray substance marking a trail on the asphalt leading up to the driver. When I reached the car, I was shocked to see that Smiley's helmet was gone, along with the top of his skull. He had essentially been scalped by the debris fence. The material on the racetrack was most of his brain. His helmet, due to massive centrifugal force, was literally pushed from his head on impact. I rode to the care center with the body. On the way in, I performed a cursory examination and realized that nearly every bone in his body was shattered. Story 22. Mellified man. Human mummy confection is a thing. As a person who would eat, drink, and bathe in honey until, after a month of excreta are nothing but honey, then death ensues. Then said person is shut in a sarcophagus for 100 years steeped in honey. This honey was then sold off for its medicinal uses. Story 23. Louis Le Prince is probably known as the father of cinematography, but he should have had more influence for a very clear reason. He disappeared without a trace. You see, Louis is credited for creating the first motion picture machine, before Edison was able to figure it out himself. I believe it was a 3-year gap between the time Louis created a machine and when Edison created his. Anyway, Le Prince has successfully created a machine capable of creating a moving picture from a film strip. Now was his chance to patent his creation, to demonstrate how it worked. At the time of his disappearance, he was seen boarding a train bound up for Paris. He got on, presumably to travel from Paris to England, then travel by boat to the US for a demonstration in New York City. It was also presumed he would go there to file for a patent on his device. However, on that day, he stepped on the train and was never heard from again. Numerous theories circle the internet. What was known about Louis at the time was that he was in severe debt and under quite a bit of pressure. Some say he got off the train early and quite simply disappeared. Others say he was murdered, the biggest suspect being Edison, who would end up getting the patent years later on his machine. I believe sometime in 2004 or so, there was a picture discovered in some French police archives of a dead man floating in the Seine in 1890, roughly the time of his disappearance. It could have been him. Maybe it was Edison's work. Maybe it was his own brother's. Or maybe he offed himself. Whatever the case, Louis Le Prince created what is cinematography today, even though Edison takes all the credit. Story 24. In the Kamar-Daban Mountains in Russia during 1993, there was the Kamar-Daban incident. Wonder how it got that name. So basically, this group of 7 tourists were hiking and camping in the mountains. I'm having a hard time finding the information for this storyline online, but basically one person starts bleeding from their facial orifices for no reason and passes away, and the leader of the group stays with them. A little while later, they hear a scream and go back, and the leader is dead. Then that same fate happens to everyone else except for one 17-year-old girl who survived by herself for I think over 2 to 3 days alone with little to no gear until she makes it somewhere and gets rescued by people. Story 25. Shipwrecks fairly regularly get stolen. Any wreck pre-45 is extremely valuable, as the steel in it is far less radioactive than any modern steel due to all the nuclear explosions that have occurred since the original Manhattan Project. Story 26. In 1944, a plane carrying 6 American airmen crashed into the ocean near Chichijima in Bonin Islands, which at the time was occupied by the Japanese. 5 of the men were close enough to swim to shore, but the 6th was separated from the group and flung out farther into the ocean. The 5 that made it to shore were quickly captured, executed, and partially cannibalized by the troops occupying the island. The 6th man was rescued and brought back into Allied care. That man was George H.W. Bush. Story 27. The story of Delphine LaLaurie. Literally terrifying what she did. She would always host house parties, and at every single party, she would end up going upstairs and coming down in a completely different dress, and nobody knew why, until the house caught on fire one day. She was caught with slaves suffering through some of the worst torture imaginable. The story is actually really interesting. The show American Horror Story covers it in a very enticing way, but Delphine's home still remains in New Orleans and you can actually tour it. Story 28. The Rideau Canal that links Ottawa, Canada to Lake Ontario on the Great Lakes and out the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic was built in the early 1800s by mostly Irish laborers. The project led by Cole, from England. The mosquitoes were so thick and carried malaria. Many of the workers died and were buried along the route, the total number being unknown but estimated at up to 1,000. The markers long rotted and places forgotten. The project ran into myriad unforeseen obstacles as it wound through swampy marshes and over rocky ridges, and took longer than expected with huge cost overruns. Call recalled to England and faced hearings over the extra costs, but he was exonerated when it was obvious the charges were overblown and spurious, given the conditions faced and the obstacles overcome. However, the damage was done, and he was forced to retire in disgrace, and received no accolades or reward for his accomplishments. Those nameless Irish lay all along that route to what is now Canada's capital city. Story 29. In 1780, the former Holy Innocents Cemetery in Paris was closed because of overuse. In 1786, the bodies were exhumed and the bones were moved to the catacombs. Many bodies had incompletely decomposed and had reduced into deposits of fat. During the exhumation, this fat was collected and subsequently turned into candles and soap. Story 30. In medieval ages, the elite would throw poor people or unwanted guests into small cells in their castle that were too small to lay down or sit in. They would then leave the person to starve. Some of these chambers would lay under the castle's bathroom, where people matter would exit into. Story 31. In the early 2000s, reports of disturbances occurred near entrances to the French catacombs. On investigation, several officers reported findings of movie theaters set up in isolated parts of the catacombs. The films often played real snuff films, and while a few tourists were caught, no organizers were. This continues to this day, though incredibly rare. Story 32. A British soldier named Henry Tandy was fighting German soldiers in World War I. A wounded German soldier came up to him one day. Henry pointed his gun at the man, ready to shoot. The man stood there, instead of fighting, accepted his fate. Tandy felt that something was different here, and he couldn't bring himself to shoot the pathetic troop in front of him. He looked around to make sure no one was looking, then lowered his gun and let the German go. That soldier he saved was Adolf Hitler. Story 33. Catholic missions throughout California sit on concerted land, including the modern churches, schools, cemeteries, and other facilities surrounding them. Many indigenous people, enslaved by the missionaries, buried them in mass, unmarked grave which are most likely still just a few feet below the soil of these buildings.